Welcome to the Steve and Caleb Show. My name is Caleb.
And my name is Steve. Here we like to talk about politics and current events from a perspective of liberty.
Oftentimes our opinions make both Republicans and Democrats uncomfortable.
Let's dive in.
We are live. This week, Steve is gone due to his work, so we will be doing another solo episode with me, Caleb. Now, pretty much ever since we started this show, I've thrown some subtle jabs towards the irony of some Republican mindsets, and if you listen to the last solo episode where it wasn't so subtle, you'd know exactly where I stand. I'm a registered Republican that is a libertarian. I can't stand being thrown in the same boat as some people who claim to be the same as me while having complete ethical differences. Now, believe it or not, about half of our current listener base is a little left-leaning, so I can't have an unbiased show without going full circle. Okay. I must be honest, though, when it comes to Republicans, you have to break down each individual problem on why things may be hypocritical or ironic. Maybe it's because I'm more involved with right-leaning people, so it's easier for me to do that. But when it comes to lefties, it's more of a shut up and point for me. You know what I mean? Because out of the problems lefties do have, they come to me so obviously, it's hard to break down such basic concepts that can't really be broken down any further. Perhaps it's because I could be ignorant, but for example, socialism is bad. History has kind of shown me that. It's hard for me to really take a magnifying glass and break down something so basic. This episode, I'm going to try and dive in the first part of the episode and pick apart a leftist idea that I just can't stand. Now, a lot of you have messaged me through Facebook, both agreeing and disagreeing, which is kind of cool because what do you expect to get out of only listening to stuff you agree with? At that point, it's just an echo chamber of things you already believe. Same goes for our more lefty listeners who are listening today. Now, what I want to pick on is the word liberal and how Democrats are grossly misusing a word that is, believe it or not, generally good, especially for a lot of Republican policy. And I will explain what I mean as I go on. So if you are to Google the definition right now, the word liberal, okay, you get the definition, I quote, a person with liberal views, a supporter or member of a liberal party. That is a lazy and modern way of explaining it, Google. Now, mainly because I really hate definitions that include the actual word I'm trying to gather information on. Seems like a basic concept to not do. So I'm going to try and make Google look pathetic, which isn't hard nowadays, and provide you with a magnifying glass to look at the word liberal. Words such as liberal, liberty, all trace their history to the Latin word Liber, which means free. So what is free? Well, the definition of free is, quote, not under the control or in the power of another. Now, I think we can all agree with this context that when freedom is mentioned in a political context, it means I can do what I want as long as I do not hurt anyone or mess with anyone's stuff. Seems like a pretty basic concept. That's actually what being a libertarian is all about. Libertarian and liberal are supposed to be basically the same thing. It's the idea of freedom to live. To have individual responsibility, of course, but not a forced collective responsibility. So the idea of things like gay marriage are a liberal view because it is an idea that two, well, presumably just two, adults have consented to take part in a way of life that hypothetically does not affect anyone else or affect anyone else's property for that matter. This is a liberal view, but just because Democrats like homosexuality doesn't mean they themselves are liberal. Forcing me and my family to give up our AR-15s is not liberal. As we just went over, Liber means not under control of another person. So how can you call yourself a liberal when you believe in forcing restrictions on others? How can you call yourself liberals when you talk about forcing others to pay a large increase in taxes? How can you call yourself liberal when you talk about forcing the Christian bakers to bake cakes for those they wish not to bake for? Either A, you aren't a liberal, and you're just grossly misusing this wonderfully crafted word, or B, you have been a victim of identity politics, and you're allowing yourself to compromise on what should be considered liberal or liberty. Now, this episode isn't about Christian bakers or anything specific like that, but it's about how the idea of force is not liberal. It's not supported under the direct context of Liber. Being liberal was about endorsing freedom with personal liberties. Want to smoke pot? Fine. Just don't do it in a way that will affect me. Do it in your home, away from my children's air, and we're cool. That's liberal. You want to shoot guns and learn about gunfighting tactics? Fine. Just don't shoot near me or my family, and we're cool. You want to say things that I may not agree with or that I find offensive? Fine. Just don't turn those words into acts of violence or oppression. That's liberalism. That's embracing the root word liber. Embracing freedom, which again means not under the control or in the power of another. Isn't forcing people to be homeless over a virus. You think I'm exaggerating? Just wait. When all these COVID-19 eviction freezes go away, a lot of people are going to be in bad shape. Why? Not because of individual choices and consequences, but because of force. Force under the control of the power of others. That's not liber, that's not liberal. When I talk about things like my gun views, I will actually say, believe it or not, my gun views are extremely liberal. And then the Republican I'll be talking with will roll his or her eyes thinking I'm referring to being a gun grabber. No. It means I want my gun rights to embrace the root Latin word, freedom. You know, it's funny because a lot of lefties claim to be the more educated side of the political spectrum, yet they can't even use the word liberal in its correct and accurate context. So, for all the lefties that consider themselves liberals, I'm challenging you to find a more accurate word. Moving on. So, I wanted to use part of this episode to bring up a past president. You probably have never heard of him, and that's honestly a good thing. Now, I say that in a good way because wouldn't it be nice to, go about our days and not really hear much of the president or any politician for that matter? We live in a society today where we demand our politicians to do more and more. We demand them to steer our lives and the lives of others in the directions we see fit. As a libertarian, I couldn't disagree more with this voter lifestyle that we have created, which is why I'm wanting to talk about President Calvin Coolidge. President Coolidge served from 1923 to 1929 as president and earned the nickname Silent Cal. He was a man who didn't waste words and give out jabs every day on social media, or back then it would probably be the newspapers. Our country got the kind of results that other politicians dream of achieving during a presidency, like higher wages, fewer strikes, low unemployment, low taxes, new technological advances. The list goes on, but the list should also receive a highlight for, believe it or not, a shrinking federal budget. By the time he left office, it was lower than when he stepped in. He believed in letting the country do its own thing. He also believed in Congress having the same mindset and discipline that he had. In the early 1920s, there were many strikes for more unions, higher taxes, and more aid. Sound familiar? He vetoed and blocked the progressive impulses by simply not signing them, and then he just didn't return them to Congress. He is quoted saying, "It is much more important to kill bad bills than to pass good ones." He vetoed 50 times. Now, a lot of people claim that he's responsible for the crash of the stock market, but that claim doesn't really have much of a leg to stand on, to be honest. I bring up Coolidge because I believe we are at a pivotal time where Republicans want more and more police militarization and police control. Progressives want more and more taxes and social control. Perhaps it's time for us to look at at President Coolidge, the legacy that he left, and try to mirror a political climate that he embodied. He even denied running for a second term because, and I quote, he had done enough. It's time for our government to embody less authority and more liberty. Listen to last week's podcast about being authoritative. The modern right and modern left is more so the authoritarian right and authoritarian left. I believe we should strive to embrace the root word liber, as we discussed earlier. Aim to be libertarian right and libertarian left. Liberty always breeds a prosperous nation, not a perfect one, but one where we have room to live as we individually see fit. Moving on. So I'm sure you've all seen the posts and memes and articles about child trafficking and pedos. There was a protest the other day, people protesting outside the CNN news center, I guess is what it's called, because they're not really focusing any of their attention on it. There's theories made against people such as Tom Hanks, Oprah, Ellen, and so on. Well, the Epstein-Maxwell documents were unsealed that apparently accused Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew, among other names, of being involved with Epstein. Now, that doesn't really come to much of a surprise for those of you who watch the Epstein documentary on Netflix. But, I don't claim that I read the documents that were just released because it's about like 250 pages long, and I'm a man with a family. So there really isn't time for me to become a detective as a hobby. But I wanted to take this time to go over the basics for those of you who don't know the whole story. Maxwell, Epstein's boo thing, was arrested, charging her with aiding Epstein. The documents that were unsealed came from a case filed back in 2015 by Epstein accuser Virginia Jeffrey against Maxwell. Now, I'm going to refer to her as Roberts because that was her name when all this was going down, so that way we don't get anybody confused. So Roberts explained how at age 15 she was working in the spa at President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach. She said Maxwell urged her to come to Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. Now, I know what you're thinking. Donald Trump is involved. No, that's not what this is saying, at least. That's just where she worked, an honest job before the sexual abuse. Just wanted to make that clear. I don't like some of Trump's stuff lately, but he isn't involved with this as far as that goes. Virginia Roberts mentions many people, but Trump is not on the list. But anyways, moving on. She was apparently introduced to Epstein for the first time as he lay naked on a massage table, and it turned into intercourse. Oh, by the way, she was 15. Roberts also describes a secret room at Epstein's place where she says there are at least 100 pictures of underage girls, most of them nude, all over a wall. Disgusting stuff. Now, one of the most significant parts to this document release is not so much the gory details, but the fact that in 2015 an email exchange was found where Epstein tells Maxwell to go outside, head held high, and to go to parties and deal with it. Not sure what all that means, but the email is significant because Maxwell's attorneys had firmly stood their ground saying she had no contact with Epstein for a decade. Obviously she had. So that's how we wound up where we are now. Now, the Bill Clinton details, according to Virginia Roberts, Bill took 2 young girls to Epstein Island who were from New York. This is in the documents that were released last week. She remembers asking Epstein what Bill Clinton was doing there, and he laughed it off and said, quote, "Well, he owes me a favor." Interesting. She says that she couldn't tell if he was serious or joking, but she recalls that he told her often about how everyone owes him favors. That's how we get a lot of the Q and QAnon theories on how the Illuminati or whatever is the swamp that Trump wants to drain. That's how we get things like PIZZA gate. I spelled it out so I don't get censored by the podcast hosting service or, suicided by the Clintons. This whole thing is a wild mess. Then you have the Prince Andrew information. There are claims from Roberts that she had to spend 2 days with Prince Andrew at Epstein's Mexico ranch. She was apparently instructed to entertain him endlessly. That's quoted. She also claims Maxwell arranged for her to have sex with Prince Andrew on multiple occasions, including once in her London home, where she was only 17. That's how Maxwell ties into the whole Prince Andrew talk. You can even find the picture of Prince Andrew with his arm around her waist, with Maxwell smiling in the background like nothing crazy is happening. The plot is super thick, and it's no longer just some stupid conspiracy. And, I looked at the picture, and the picture looks pretty real. People will say it's doctored, but like Prince Andrew's hands, they're both the same color. It goes well. There's no pixel distortion, or it looks authentic. It's insane, and I can only handle so much of this. If you all haven't seen the Jeffrey Epstein documentary series on Netflix, I would highly recommend it. Not for the sake of viewing pleasures, for obviously sad reasons, but for the sake of awareness of current events. I fear that we may be approaching a point where the media will be trying pretty hard to soften the fall of whoever the bad guys are at the end of this tunnel. I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, but this has become a very real thing. Now, I'm sorry that this week's episode was a little short. Next week, Steve will be back in action here in our podcast studio. Please, 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 if you want to help support this show and haven't already, hit the subscribe on the podcast app that you're using. Give us a good 5-star review if we have deserved it. Share our Facebook posts. You get on Facebook, like the page, The Steve and Caleb Show. We really appreciate the huge support we have at such an early stage. Being this early in the podcast creating stage, episodes can be, super short or super long. There might be different pauses and certain episodes. It's just a learning process, and you guys have been awesome. We will never ask for money on Patreon or any of those websites. If you haven't noticed already, we pride ourselves in being unbiased. Lately, we've gotten a good bunch of messages from you guys explaining how you feel, and we encourage more of that. I think it would also be a good idea to start a mailbag. A mailbag is a way for podcasts to bring in and read listeners' questions and messages live on the show and give our own unique responses. So send us messages on the Facebook page. We should respond to them within the day whenever you do send them. And just let us know you want that question on the show, and I'm sure we can work it out. But it only works if you do. So hit us up, and we will see you next week.